Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm very excited about this topic, and I know it's something that all of you have been looking at as well. There have been a number of articles published and various people talking about all the different aspects of returning to work, particularly for office-based employees. So Sam, I want to start with you. You did some research recently. You partnered with RJE Business Interiors to create this research. Tell us a little bit about the research itself and what it revealed.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were commissioned by RJE because they had a great deal of curiosity around really one word, and that word was productivity. So they wanted to understand and have a third party study this both qualitatively and quantitatively to understand really what was going on with folks as it related to remote versus in-person work. So we were enabled to study 16 different organizations across the Midwest, and we studied how these people were working sort of day to day in, I would call it sort of an anthropological style of research. So it wasn't as if we sent, several people a survey and tried to understand, via some open-ended questions that they were typing into a survey response, what was going on, but it was more face-to-face interviews, quantifiably asking them to catalog how they were working during any given day. And the people in our study also ranged in a lot of different demographics. So we had a really nice representation of age that was very, reflective of the current workforce. We had people in every sort of job level. So we had executives, middle managers, individual contributors. And then we also had sort of three components of people working in terms of about a third of the people in our study were working fully at home, about a third were working fully in the office, and about a third were in hybrid model already, kind of doing a little bit of both. So we were able to look through all those different demographic lenses and better understand sort of what was going on fourth quarter of 2020 as people had started to settle into working, in the middle of a pandemic. So for us as research nerds, it was a blessing. It was such a cool study to get to have the opportunity to be able to conduct.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. And from our conversations, you've told me it sounds like a hybrid model is the way that a lot of organizations are starting to go. And it's really the way that employees seem to want to go going forward. We know that things are never going to go back to exactly the way they were before the pandemic. That's been made pretty clear. Yeah. And because of that, it sounds like there's a lot of interest in doing something different that meets a lot of different kinds of needs. So you did this research. Yep. You found that was kind of the direction that a lot of people were interested in going. I want to ask now Meg if she can kind of elaborate on what she's seeing in terms of choices that office worker-based clients are making for the future.
Yeah, and so first I want to say, Sam, I think this type of research that you are doing is so important to these conversations. So thank you for sharing it. And from the Shoff perspective, I can 100% validate that hybrid is the direction that most of us are moving, right? I don't think we have a single client at Shoff that I'm aware of that is not going to a more flexible protocol than before the pandemic. And from the employee engagement perspective, it is our opinion that this is ultimately going to be a great thing. The employee centricity around the hybrid model, from research, we know that the more autonomy that you give employees and the more control that they feel over how and when their work gets done, you see improvements in engagement, you see improvements in productivity, in satisfaction, etc. So ultimately, I think the hybrid model is going to be a great thing for the global workforce. But I think in the interim, where we are going to see some challenges for organizations is around organizational culture. And I know we're going to dive into this a little bit more, Sam, later, but the reason why, and I predict that is where we're going to see the need for a lot of focus kind of in the near future, because, most likely your organization's culture, the cultural norms and behaviors and the cornerstones were defined in the context of synchronous work, right? So work mostly together, mostly at the same time. And now that we are going to be working much more asynchronously, that is certainly going to alter the fabric of our organizational cultures a little bit. And so as a specific example, something that we're working on with the Shoff client right now is around an effort to get this organization's employees, encourage them to keep their cameras on during meetings, because, you know, after more than a year of being remote, people are experiencing this very real phenomenon of Zoom fatigue, and that's understandable. But it is a part of this organization's culture to have that face-to-face, whether that is face-to-face virtually or not, that type of collaboration. And so that cultural cornerstone is slowly getting, you know, eroded by this people not keeping their cameras on. So anyway, focusing on things like that, I think we're going to have to really, I think we're going to see a big focus on how the hybrid model is going to inevitably shift culture. And I think two things, I want to turn it back to you, Catherine. One thing I want to point out is that work that we are doing with the client around turn your camera on, they are still in a remote protocol, but just think of how much more that collaboration divide could be if people are back in a hybrid model and you do have people that are physically there in the office collaborating face to face, and you still have people joining remotely with their cameras off. So I think all of these considerations are food for thought. And before I jump back to Catherine, I want to just ask the folks in the audience, what are some of the cultural cornerstones or behaviors in your organization that you think might be challenged by the hybrid model, and maybe what is your organization doing to address them?
Yeah, if anyone has a comment or wants to throw out a question or an observation, we welcome that. If you want to just unmute and share right now, or if you want to add something to the chat, we can certainly call on you either way. If anyone has anything.
Good morning. I do have just kind of a comment, and I'd love to hear what you might have to say about this. I've heard it termed proximal disparity, which, you know, is fancy language for what Meg was just talking about. And I heard a talk recently from Atlassian. They've kind of been a remote first culture for a while, so they've had some practice with it, even pre-pandemic. And one of the strategies that they recommended was, you know, if you have some employees in office and some employees not, that if one employee is remote, everybody is remote. So everybody goes into their individual cube or office, but everybody's on camera instead of a group gathered when it's safely to do so again, and then individuals sort of remotely. And that creates sort of some bias in a way. And so I'd love to hear your comments on that, as well as the role of communicators in training leaders with strategies like this, how to be effective in this new world. And maybe, I'm sure you're going to get into that, but it affects things like this, I think, as we return.
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. I think we are going to touch on that in a little more detail here in a minute. But another thing that we're going to touch on is this idea of disparity, and how important it is that when you're implementing your approach and training your leaders and managers to implement this approach, that you do so in a way that is both inclusive and fair to how your different types of employees are going to experience and benefit from and be challenged by a hybrid model. So there's so many considerations there. And to your point about when you're remote, making that environment, having some parity in the environment physically. That, I don't know, Sam, I know some of your research may even touch on that.
Yeah, this is so interesting because it's such that sort of third dimension of when we start to go back and when we are in the hybrid model and when some of us are there and some of us aren't, and how do we handle that? And I love your proximal disparity, or I can't remember exactly what you said, but another one of my more favorite words that I've learned in the pandemic or recently was propinquity, like humans like to be together near each other. It will be really interesting to figure out how organizations, again, sort of from a cultural standpoint, what do we value? How do we behave? What do we believe in? How do we handle things like what you just described? Because there are folks that will work in a completely remote environment, sometimes completely full time. And if we don't, maybe at the leadership level, think about the equity, kind of the through line of equity in that, there could be unintended consequences that are negative. But I think one thing I can like quantitatively point to is that when humans are doing something that is strategic in nature, creative in nature, they have a desire to do that in person together. So we collected data in the middle of a pandemic that proved when organizations had one of those two types of meetings occurring, that they were somehow finding a way to convene in person to do them. So I think that organizations at some point might start to consider what the behavior, what the purpose is for convening, and then put parameters around how that might occur. So if we're working on some project task that's day to day, maybe then that's when we say, yes, go to your Zoom rooms if you're in person in the office, so the remote people don't miss out on the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting. And, the facial expressions they can't read because they can't see the whole conference room or whatever. But we might then also have a policy that if we're going to run a strategic or creative meeting, or we're going to try to do something that's innovative in nature, then we'd prefer if the team convened in person, if at all possible, or whatever. But it's going to be again, I go back to that equity. I think it's going to be so important to be equitable in that and make sure that leaders convey that information to the team. Because if you don't, I think that organizations will start to see attrition because we'll break down trust. They will leave management styles that they don't see as equitable across the board or whatever. And that's going to be a huge focus. I think that's where organizations in hybrid will succeed or fail, is if they can figure out that sort of trust, equity, accountability model, or if they don't.
Sam, let's go a little bit deeper into some of the research, because you really started to touch on that in some instances, the reason for getting together makes a difference for whether or not it's as effective as you want it to be, either being remote, being in person, or being in some sort of hybrid model. And your study touched on about 5 different areas that could be impacted either positively or negatively by the remote, hybrid, or in-office situation. So can you talk a little bit about that, what exactly it was you were studying, and what that revealed?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. And I think maybe I'll just, Catherine, share 2 slides to try to walk through this.
Yeah.
So let's see here. So we were studying 5 components: creativity, innovation, strategy, collaboration, and productivity. And we wanted to understand how everyday people thought about these components of work. And so when you see this pyramid, the white words are the words we were studying, and the gray words are how people articulate those words back to us. So they're sort of jargon words that we're studying. And then we're trying to understand, when they tell us about these things, what do they really mean or think? So like, for example, when they talk about creativity to us, what a lot of times folks, especially not like, I'm going to use air quotes, but like not people who are, let's say, creatives, like probably many of the folks at Shoff might be, but like an everyday person talking about creativity, they talk about like human energy. They'll say like, oh, it's like when I'm being creative, it's when I'm with someone, we have a lot of energy. Or innovation, they talk about their need for communication. Collaboration, they need to access people. Strategy, they associate with effort or purpose. And then productivity is so fascinating. When people talk about productivity, they're often talking about their own individual responsibilities. And to us, productivity became really fascinating because there were two definitions that emerged. One was about the individual. So I am productive if I get to the bottom of, let's say, my task list. But a lot of times a leader might give us a different definition, and they would talk about productivity encompassing almost this entire pyramid. They would talk about it more from the organizational perspective. We are productive if we are collaborative and strategic and creative, et cetera. And so what is important probably is for leaders to make sure that they're establishing what their definition for productivity is, so that individual contributors and middle managers can be on the same page and everyone can sort of be pushing in the same direction or knowing what type of productivity we're talking about. The bottom of the pyramid, we do have evidence that some of those things, creativity, strategy, those are the things that people really appreciate doing together, physically together. Innovation and collaboration, there's a case kind of for both in some situations where they see a value in being able to, let's say, engage people quicker and easier across, let's say, the country or the globe or in different cities or places like that. So they feel like they can be innovative wider. And they're talking about their collaboration tools are increasing, but they're still sort of nostalgic for what we used to maybe view as in-person collaboration. So people think about it a little differently right now, but productivity, if we're talking about it at the individual level, we probably are able to be, let's say, more productive if we're talking about like focus, getting tasks done in a remote setting. Whereas as we get towards the bottom of the pyramid, those are the things that are probably, let's say, easier for us to do as humans when we're convening together. It doesn't mean we can't, and all of these things, it doesn't mean we can't do them either in an office or at home. It's just sort of what level of effort we might have to push into it. So like if I'm in an open office and there's a lot going on, it might be harder for me to focus and get my tasks done. If I'm trying to be creative and high energy, it might be hard. If, like Meg said, I'm at home and none of my colleagues have their camera on and I can't get any of the energy I need from them. So this whole thing is, there's tension between the two, and the smart organizations will probably figure out how to execute these. And Catherine, stop me if I'm going on too long here, but I'll kind of try to quickly explain. We built, based on the data we collected, these scenarios for effort that people would have to apply in each of the 5 areas, whether they were in an office, at home, or in a hybrid model. So when we're in the office, the first 4, so the bottom of that pyramid, the office does some of the work for us. It's us as humans, we don't have to apply as much effort to be as effective if this is an efficacy graph. Whereas sort of exactly what I talked about at home, productivity is a little bit easier on the individual level. But the hybrid model is where we focused a lot of energy and actually picked up a second study to look at this, because when we looked at hybrid, just like Meg was talking about, there's all kinds of challenges that we'll face when we're trying to do some of these components. So for example, if we're going to have a creative meeting, we've got 3 people in the office and 2 people not. Can we use whiteboards? Can we use Post-it notes? Like, should we have mailed something out ahead of time? Like, there's just a lot more human effort we have to apply. It doesn't mean we can't overcome this. It just means we have to think differently now and work harder at it to get to achieve the efficacy we want. So that was, I think, some of the kind of high level findings from that study.
That's so interesting. I would love at this point for Meg to talk a little bit about that. You know, your key idea there was, doesn't mean we can't do it. It's just that we have to think differently about how we do it. And to me, I'm biased, but as a communications professional, I think that that's very much grounded in good communications and setting the right expectations and being transparent and vulnerable and recognizing that we may have to make changes. We may start something and try it and it doesn't really work the way we thought it would, and we need to change course. And so leaders have to be constantly communicating expectations and direction. So Meg, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that, the culture and the communication element of what we're talking about here.
I mean, there are so many considerations for communicators, right? But I think we could spend hours talking about it, but I think from our perspective, from my perspective, there's kind of four main things, and we touched on this a little bit a few minutes ago, but I think first of all, just making sure that the employee voice is represented in your decision making. So you don't want your hybrid arrangement at the very least to reinforce or somehow replicate negative undesirable things about your culture previously, because any sense of kind of disparity or unfairness or not or exclusivity is going to erode any kind of benefit that you are going to get from a more flexible working arrangement. So I think the idea here is not to cut corners in making sure that you are listening to the voice of your employees. So one interesting thing that I'm seeing an organization do to address this is kind of much like they would do for a sophisticated external marketing campaign, is doing the research to create employee personas in the hybrid environment. What are the types of employees? What are their different challenges? What are their different preferences in the hybrid model? And kind of codifying what the approach is and what the key messages are for leaders and managers for those different employee archetypes or employee personas, if you will, in a playbook. What a good resource to have as a leader or manager to be communicating, all of these things. So that's something that we're seeing, but that's a pretty extensive and sophisticated effort for those organizations that maybe don't have the resources to be able to do an extensive effort like that. Don't forget about the simple tools that you have in simple surveys and one-on-one conversations. Again, I think the takeaway is don't cut corners at this point, trying to listen to and incorporate the voice and perspective of the employee. So I think that's one thing. And then some other things, I think there's three things. We love to do things in threes, right? But the way I would summarize it is number one, revisit. Number two, redefine. And number three, clarify. So revisit, going back to our conversation about culture, it could be time to dust off your core values at your organization. Take another look at them. And I'm not saying that your organization needs to completely rewrite your core values. Hopefully they still resonate and represent the company that you want to be, but have new values emerged during this time? Let's say, for example, empathy or employee centricity or vulnerability or transparency. Are there new core values that have emerged that you need to revisit as part of trying to articulate, how those values are going to be lived out in a hybrid environment? So revisit your core values, those sit at the top of your culture, right? That's one. Number two, redefine, like we were talking about before, some of those cultural norms. Are we going to agree that togetherness is a part of our culture? Togetherness at least part of the time. And if we are, we need to clearly articulate that expectation, not only articulate, what the benefit is to our organization for togetherness, but we also have to communicate the expectation around it and what the trade-offs are going to be around it. I heard someone say, and I thought this was kind of funny, that like the hybrid model is not a dessert buffet. There are going to be some trade-offs that you need to communicate. And that leads me to number three, which is clarify. Once you have kind of redefined what your cultural behaviors are going to be in this new hybrid environment, you need to be very clear about communicating those to employees. And one of the ways that you can do this is through your employee value proposition. So I'm going to share my screen here in a minute. An employee value proposition is much more of an extensive effort than the high-level example that I'm going to show you. But one tool that we use with clients to help clarify some of the expectations and trade-offs that are involved in those cultural cornerstones is this employee value proposition model. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the model on my screen? Okay. And talking about, in our model here, the employee experience is reflected on the left. So for example, in the context of hybrid work, I now have the flexibility to generally determine my own in-office schedule. But what is the trade-off and what is the expectation? That is that I maintain visibility and accessibility with my teams. And maybe that could mean that I am generally expected to have my camera on when I'm in meetings, or that could mean, Sam and Catherine, I think you've both mentioned this, that my physical in-person attendance is expected at certain activities for the company. The second example here is that I am now given the autonomy to decide when my work gets done. We're talking about asynchronous work now. And Catherine, you mentioned before we got on the call, there are people that do their best work at 3 o'clock in the morning. In a hybrid model, a more flexible model is more supportive of that. So if I have the autonomy to decide when my work gets done, I know that the expectation is still that I'm going to be demonstrating the highest levels of accountability. I'm still going to be delivering work on time. I'm still going to be meeting whatever the requirements are of my job. So in terms of having a tool to really clearly articulate what those new benefits are of a hybrid working environment, but what the expectations and trade-offs are, we like to use this employee value proposition model with clients to help leaders and managers be able to have those conversations with more clarity and more intention.
That's great, Meg. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully that brings it to life for folks. And a lot of times it really is just being very clear and communicating those expectations. Catherine Malarski asked if we're going to have a recording of this session available, and we will. So that should be available sometime next week. And if you signed up for today's event, you'll get an email with a link to that recording. And we also put together a summary blog on our website so that you have access to some of the key points and make it easy for sharing with your team or your clients or other people who you think would be interested in the topic. I'd love to open it back up again. And if there's anyone else who has a comment, an observation, a question, also, if you're in the middle of working on a return to work strategy yourself right now, what are the things that you're having difficulty with? There may be other people on the call, other resources here, people who've had the same experiences that you've had, who can share what they're doing that could be helpful. So if anyone has any of those thoughts, please feel free to put that in the chat or just pipe up and let's talk about it.
I'm Chantel Stone. I'm with the Mass Ave Merchants Association, and I am struggling with our on our online presence right now with Zoom meetings, just because it's my persona to be in person and to be around people. It's more my style. But we've, since the pandemic, we've stayed online, and before it was great. I was bringing all of our merchants to different locations on the avenue to showcase their businesses and really promote them, and offer a little sample of what they might have to our members to help spread the word. And that was great. I'd like to reintroduce that. We did try a hybrid model one time, but it wasn't very successful. So I appreciate what your comments are, and maybe revisiting it and fine tuning it, and finding out what the technology problems were and how to fix those. But engagement is tough, and I like the ideas of what you're saying of productivity and trying to get everybody really engaged and keeping the camera on. So thank you. This is my first Shoff Chat, and I've been trying to share it with our members to take advantage of it. So I had to check it out for myself. So thank you, and I'll let you guys get back to your show.
Thank you, Chantel. Appreciate the comment. Meg, I'm curious if you have any other tips or thoughts for leaders who might be thinking through how they communicate their return to work strategy, almost like from a launch perspective, and really getting off on the right foot with that first major communication. Let's say they've set a date and said, things are going to change. Our return to work date is June 15th. And here are some things that you should know as we approach that date.
I think probably one of the best practices that we try to share with clients about that is simply to share what you know as soon as you can. Meaning, I think as communicators, we are often we want everything to be perfect. We want to know all of the answers when we are sharing out, especially with employees, because we want to be as accurate and transparent as possible. But when it comes to something that is so fluid and influenced by outside factors as return to work, is what can you communicate as soon as possible? Meaning, we may not know exactly what our office layout is going to look like when we return, but we do know that it's going to be different than it was when we left. We may not know what the mask mandate or the PPE mandate is going to be when and where we come back, but we do know that we will probably, there are probably colleagues that will still be more comfortable wearing masks. So I think starting out by communicating what you know as soon as possible is probably a good place to start, even if you don't know or even exactly when you'll be coming back. Here are the foundational things that we know, so that employees can have the proper expectations and preparation for when they do return, is going to make your communications around those details even more smooth. I think another consideration that and I don't have all the answers to this, right? But it's just something I'm observing, is that it has been so much more straightforward to communicate around a protocol that it is going to be about communicating around preference. Meaning, it is more straightforward to say the CDC guidance is this, or the local, or state mask mandate is this. But when we go back to the hybrid model, we're talking about employee preferences and employee centricity having such a big factor in how work gets done. It is going to be more challenging and nuanced to communicate around how those preferences and accommodating those preferences are still serving the needs of the business and the needs of the moment. So, that's just and if anyone has any thoughts on that in the chat, or to bring that up, that's another big consideration around return to work. Your return to work communications are going to shift from protocol to preference pretty quickly, and I think we're going to get to a best practice operationally with return to work sooner than we are culturally. So just curious if anyone has any thoughts or observations on that.
While folks are thinking that one through, Sam, I would love for you to address something that Dawn brings up in the chat. She asks about, did you study any different types of job functions and how they may work better or not better with a hybrid format? So if you want to go into maybe a little bit of detail on that part of the research, that could be helpful.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So our first study, we did not break people down by job function. But we learned in the study that was probably the demographic that mattered the most. So whereas like age didn't seem to matter as much, job level kind of had its own interesting components to it. But we learned in that study that the type of job, or let's say maybe the business unit the person was in, or the type of work that they were doing really did matter in terms of how they were going to be able to hybrid. So in the study we did that focused fully on hybrid, we actually very intentionally went out and sought people in different types of job functions within the organizations that we studied in the second study. And it wasn't that I could tell you like, oh, marketing office, customer service should be at home. Like it's not as black and white as that, but it's probably what we learned was it's important for an organization to maybe look through that lens of job function and figure out what makes sense for their group based on the type of work that, let's say, their marketing team might do, or their accounts payable team might do, or whatever. And the other component of that was, if you just sort of look, let's say, uniquely at that, I would say be careful looking just uniquely at the business unit or the department without thinking about how they affect other groups. So the example I can give in this is like a group we were studying, the marketing team was like, actually, we're most effective at home, but let's say the sales team in that same business said it's really detrimental to us when the marketing team is at home. And so how do you figure out how to overcome, sort of that you got to maybe think about the Gestalt principle in this, like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So definitely look at the parts and decide if you can use that as a way to kind of figure out who's going to be where. But then think about what sort of, if you pull on that string, what other strings are affected, or, you untie one knot, you make a mess over here somewhere. So it's probably important to look at the whole thing. But departments are definitely a good place to start. That's a good demographic to slice by.
That's a really excellent point. And it's actually something that we've been talking about at Shoff with our own team. Some departments think, working from home anytime and all the time is actually great. I get a lot done, particularly, let's say, for example, a writer. If someone's primary job is to spend the day writing, it completely makes sense that they would be very effective and productive at home. But if your job is an art director, and as an art director, you need to speak to the client-facing account person, and you need to speak to or work with the writer, and you need to work with the video editor, it could potentially get a lot more problematic. Your world is very different than the writer who's working at home to produce copy, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that's excellent advice, really thinking that through and thinking about the whole and not just the parts of the organization and how they impact each other.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Anyone have any other experiences or concerns that you're facing as your organization moves in a potentially new direction? And I'm also curious about this. Do you have leaders in your organization who are adamant or very, they've kind of made up their own minds about, well, this is what we need to do, and that might fly a bit in the face of the employee sentiment that you're getting and how you're working through that? I'm curious if anyone's having that particular concern, or if you think that could be a concern going forward.
I think, Catherine, that especially underscores the idea of just making sure that you understand what that employee sentiment is, and speaks to the importance of leadership alignment, right? Which is a whole Shoff Chat in itself. But one of the things that's been helpful for me to keep in mind as an internal communicator, I know we have quite a few internal communicators on the chat today, is that keeping in mind kind of what we call the three-legged stool of internal communication. So remembering that you're trying to balance the needs of the business, the needs of the moment, which right now we're talking about return to work and hybrid and COVID, and the needs of the employee. So making sure that and sometimes those priorities are unequally balanced, right, depending on what's going on, but remembering that those three elements are so important to decision making and how we're going to decide to implement an approach and how leaders are going to communicate. So kind of keeping that in mind as you are navigating through different humans that are going to have different thoughts about what's right and what's not, in terms of their leadership style and communications, but also in terms of how they implement new approaches.
Right.
I was going to add on to that, Catherine, if you don't mind. We just we're talking to a client yesterday where we were conducting some research for them, and we were trying to understand employee sentiment. That was a big component of this. One thing that was so fascinating to us, so this is a group that's fully remote still. And we asked a series of questions about how effective are you personally working remote? How effective is your team working remote? And how effective is the organization as a whole working remote? And what's so interesting is their individual perspective on themselves. So everyone rates their ability to work from home very, very high. Like it's, if we're on a 5-point scale, they're at like 4.5. And then it stair steps down, how well do we think teams are doing from home? Like we might step down to like a, 3.5 to 4. And then how well is the organization as a whole doing? And that steps down again. So I think we need to try to help everyone consider multiple perspectives and what's going on right now, especially if we're fairly siloed at home. We can't kind of see beyond maybe our own walls at home. And so we have this sort of I'm good perspective, but I can tell that not everyone else is good. And if we can't overcome that, or if we can't help ourselves all be maybe more introspective on maybe I'm not actually perfect in what I'm doing here. And there's ways I could think about adjusting or changing, but it's really hard, I think, when we can't maybe experience across the organization like we maybe could in the past.
So to that point, Sam, I think that's excellent. And it reminds me of something that I'm experiencing right now. I've polled very informally part of our staff, and another leader in our organization has polled another part of our staff, but we ask the same questions. So it's kind of a departmental look where we're asking about feelings on returning to work. And so we're getting some actual interesting verbatims from people that speak to this, where they're saying, in a hybrid environment, I feel like this about my work, but if I need to interact with this kind of person for this kind of work, I'm concerned about this from a hybrid perspective, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really good insight that I don't necessarily have as a leader, who I don't do that day-to-day job. So it's an interesting perspective for me to keep in mind. And I think it would also be an interesting perspective for me to share more broadly, so that it kind of answers that question of why. Once we do make our final decision on this is what our hybrid environment looks like, and these are the expectations going forward, I feel like I need to put a bit of a why in there. So Meg, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in terms of, how far do you go in making the case, and I don't want to say defending your decisions or the direction, but in a sense, making sure people understand the why so that they embrace it.
Yeah, I think that takes us back to the importance of being really clear about what this is an important part of our culture. That's the why, and here's the benefit that we get from in-person collaboration. And here, just being very clear about what those expectations are. But of course, sharing the why. I mean, sharing the why is kind of the cornerstone of all employee communications when you're trying to change behaviors or mindsets. So I think that question speaks to the importance of clarifying the why very intentionally as part of strategically communicating what the approach you're going back to is. But I also wanted to, I think Julie Norman had a really, I want to address her question about leaders being convinced that in office is still the way to go. And something that we haven't, not to take away from your question, Catherine, but something we haven't even touched on yet in this conversation is the idea of competitiveness for your organization. So employees want hybrid. We've heard that loud and clear, right? And in all of these conversations and research and Julie, speaking the language of senior leaders in a way that they may start to see the value of a hybrid work environment is now that employees want it, and a lot of organizations are going to be offering it. To have a protocol or approach where that is not available in your organization may pose a risk to your competitiveness. And these employees are going to have options to go across the street to your competitor, to go to a more flexible work environment. So I think in terms of anything you can do to speak their language, is there any measure of increased productivity that you can demonstrate from how people have been able to be more productive in the remote or hybrid environment? I think might go a long way towards breaking through with those leaders that this is something that they want to consider. And again, we're reminding them that there are trade-offs. You can still articulate expectations from your workforce in the hybrid environment. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of studies out right now that I'm going to misquote, but I think there's an IBM study about like within the next 5 years, 80% of the workforce will change jobs or something crazy like that, which probably will speak to this that Julie's talking about. That and then what you just said, Meg, that the cultures are going to shift pretty drastically, and people will choose if that's what they want to be a part of or not. Like we were working with a client that in October, we were measuring how they were getting along in a remote setting, and leadership decided that the work that they were doing needed to be done in person, and they called the office back in October. And shortly thereafter, they had a few folks that left immediately, because that was not the environment that they wanted to be working in anymore. But leadership they knew that was going to be, a consequence of what their actions were. They also knew that their business needed to run, in a certain way. And I think those are going to have to, just like you said, Meg, those will have to be the decisions that are going to have to be trade-offs. Do we work better this way? If yes, we're going to have to understand that we're going to have to change talent or shift talent, or not everyone's going to be able to come along with what we're thinking here. And people are going to have to sort of be okay with that. It is, when we study and test preference for how many days people want to be in the office, the most common we'll find the biggest swell in the graph somewhere between 2 and 3 days a week. So a lot of people actually do want to come in a couple days a week. But there are those folks too that want to be in 5 days a week. There are people that do want that. But there's probably more that want full-time remote. But I think there's a very big swell of people who want to be in a couple days a week.
Sam, one last question I'd like to throw out for you, or just a comment. Let's see, Katie mentions the idea of generational differences that could be at play in terms of the return to work mindset. You mentioned earlier that in the research that you did, that you did look at demographics, but that perhaps it didn't have as big of an impact as maybe what you thought it might have going in. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you saw there?
In terms of age, I think the demographic of age, yeah.
Yes.
To be honest, in almost all the work we do, we never find age to be a super interesting demographic. Like, this is just us. We don't put a ton of weight behind generational, especially when we get down to the organization. Yes, across the aggregate, probably a very wide sweeping study, you'll flatten out and you'll start to get maybe some generational, insights. But we find that from one organization to the next, if we look at age, it can be vastly different. So for example, one organization, all the, let's say, youngest or least tenured and most tenured are more ready to come back. And then at the next organization, that might completely flip. And to us, it indicates that it's not always, or many times it's not age that matters. It is more about the cultural makeup of the organization. So we didn't find any interesting insights in our first study related to age. We didn't report on it. There wasn't anything statistically significant in it. And so it's not something that we always, and I can tell you across many conversations I've had, I've got boomers that want to be at home full time. I've got them who want to be in full time. I've got, same thing with millennials, want to be in, want to be out. And to us, there's a lot more, you can find more interesting insights at a more nuanced level than generation. I don't know that that's always fair to people.
That's great. Thank you for that insight. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to give you an opportunity, Sam, to mention, I believe you're working on some additional research. What exactly is that, and what should we expect from that?
Yeah, we did this second study that I've kind of alluded to that was focused around basically understanding how to effectively carry out a hybrid work model, because we found out from my bar graphs that I was showing, hybrid is going to be hard to pull off, but it is the model, like Meg talked about, that everyone wants. That's what humans want. We want agency. We want autonomy. That will be the model that will attract and retain likely talent in many organizations. So we wanted to learn more about that. So we did a study, and we actually wrote a how-to guide for leadership teams if they're trying to navigate through establishing a hybrid model for themselves. So we have this book. I wish I had one on my desk, but it's called Hello Hybrid. So if you're interested, it's hellohybrid.info is where we set it on the internet for people that want a copy of it. But it's a framework for thinking through how do we hybrid, because everyone's is going to be different. And I would say the most interesting finding from that, we had a completely different outline for this book. And when we started to do our work, what emerged was that if anyone was going to be successful at the hybrid model, they would first have to establish what trust looked like inside their organization related to hybrid. So if leaderships couldn't lay down what trust looked like and how they were going to effectively carry that out, they didn't really matter what they did beyond that, they would not succeed. So if that's a helpful tip for anyone that's establishing, a hybrid model, really think deeply about how you establish trust between managers and individual contributors and leaders. That's huge.
That's really great. And that's a great way to end our conversation today, is thinking about that trust element, because without it, your model, no matter what the model is, will likely not be successful. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think this has been an excellent conversation, and hopefully it's given you a lot of things to think about in your own organizations. I do want to let you know that we will have another Shoff Chat at the beginning of June. It will be on Thursday, June 10th, and it will be on an employee engagement topic. Our working title right now is Empathy is the New Engagement. So it really goes kind of hand in hand with what we've been talking about today. So we'll be announcing more details about that and sharing a sign-up link, a registration link with you all very soon. So we will get that information out. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a recap blog about today's session available, along with a recording of today's session. And we'll have that out next week on the Shoff social channels, as well as on our website. And we will send that back to everyone who registered today. We really invite all of you to share that information. It's something that we see a lot of value in, is constantly learning and growing as professionals. And that's really our main goal with what we provide through Shoff Chats. So we want you to share that with others as well. Also, we will be sending out soon to anyone who has registered for a Shoff Chat a survey. We've been at this a year now, believe it or not. And we would love to have your feedback so that we can just continue to do a better and better job and make our content even more relevant to you and our format, and think about all the things that go into putting this together. So we really would appreciate and value your feedback on that. So watch for that link in the coming weeks as well. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great week.